Imagine waking up 10 years from now and discovering that the economy still needs human beings, just not in the way it used to. The machines are faster. The software is smarter. One employee can now do what once required an entire department. Companies are producing more with fewer people, and the most powerful tools in the economy are no longer factories or oil fields. They are models, chips, data centers, and algorithms. At first, that sounds like progress. And it is. But there is a strange question hiding underneath that progress. What happens when the machines become extraordinarily productive, but you don't own the machines? Because throughout history, there has been a simple relationship between economic power and ownership. The people who control the most important productive assets usually had the greatest ability to decide who worked, under what conditions, and who received the rewards. Centuries ago, that asset was land. Today, it may be something far less visible. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable. There is no evidence that AI is simply destroying every job. In fact, the latest research shows a much more complicated picture. But among young workers entering highly AI-exposed occupations, a warning sign has emerged. By June 2026, employment for workers aged 22 to 25 in those occupations was about 19% below the level expected relative to less exposed occupations. Stanford's researchers also found that the weakness has been driven mainly by reduced hiring rather than mass layoffs. So perhaps the real question isn't, will AI take your job? It may be something much bigger. Will AI change who has economic power? To find out, we need to answer three questions. First, why did ordinary workers once gain bargaining power when the old economic order collapsed? Second, what happens when AI becomes the most powerful productive tool in the economy, but most workers only rent access to it? And third, if AI makes workers dramatically more productive, who actually gets to keep the wealth that productivity creates? Because the answer to that final question may determine whether AI becomes the greatest expansion of human prosperity in history, or the beginning of a new economic hierarchy. For most of human history, economic power was surprisingly easy to see. You could walk outside and point at it. It was land. A field produced food. A forest produced timber. A mine produced metal. Whoever controlled those resources had leverage over the people who needed them. That was one of the defining realities of medieval Europe. The details of feudal society varied enormously across regions and centuries, but the basic economic relationship was straightforward. Landowners controlled productive land, while peasants and serfs worked it. The worker produced value from the land without owning the primary asset that made that production possible. That distinction mattered enormously. A person could work from sunrise to sunset, produce more food, improve the harvest, and still have very limited control over what happened to the surplus. The system could be stable for a very long time precisely because the people at the bottom had very few alternatives. But stability is not the same thing as prosperity. When productive assets are concentrated, the people who control them can often extract value without needing to compete very hard for it. And when workers have nowhere else to go, their bargaining power remains weak. Then history delivered something nobody had planned for. The Black Death, between 1347 and 1353, plague devastated Europe, killing a huge share of the population. The exact death toll is debated, but the economic consequence was unmistakable. There were suddenly far fewer workers available to work the land, and that changed the balance. A lord could own thousands of acres, but empty fields produced nothing. Land had become abundant. Labor had become scarce. And when labor became scarce, workers became more valuable. Wages rose in many places. Landowners faced greater difficulty maintaining the old arrangements. Governments even attempted to restrict wages and worker movement, including England's Statute of Labours of 1351. But economic incentives had changed. For the first time, the worker had something the old system had denied him: leverage. The lesson is bigger than the plague itself. Economic systems become unstable when the thing they depend on most changes. And Europe had just experienced one of the most important changes imaginable. The scarce resource was no longer simply land. Human labor had become scarce. That created an incentive to replace labor with tools, invest in capital, and experiment with more productive ways of doing things. In other words, the economic system began rewarding something the old order had often punished: productivity. That transition matters because it gives us a way to understand the present. Today, nobody needs to physically own a field to participate in the economy. You can work from a laptop. You can run a company without owning an office. You can publish to millions of people without owning a printing press. And yet the same underlying question has survived. Who controls a productive asset? Only now the answer is much harder to see. It may be sitting inside a server rack. It may be encoded inside a model. It may exist behind an API. And it may require billions of dollars of infrastructure before an ordinary person can even touch it. That is where the old story starts colliding with the new one. The most important thing about modern AI isn't the chatbot sitting on your screen. It's everything behind it. Advanced AI depends on enormous computing infrastructure. Specialized chips, data centers, networking, electricity, cooling systems, cloud platforms, and vast amounts of capital. The OECD's recent work on AI infrastructure describes high concentration and major barriers to entry across several parts of the supply chain, with some segments dominated by a handful of firms and some key components requiring enormous capital investment. That changes the nature of the argument, because when we say AI is making workers more productive, we are really saying that workers are gaining access to an incredibly powerful machine. But access is not ownership. And that distinction could become one of the defining economic questions of the AI era. Imagine two workers. The first owns a powerful AI system that can research, write, analyze, code, design, and automate. The second worker performs the same tasks inside a company that owns the AI. Both may become more productive, but their economic positions are completely different. The first owns part of productive capability. The second is selling labor to whoever owns it. That's where the modern version of the old story begins to take shape. Not because AI companies are literally medieval lords. They aren't. And workers are not literally serfs. They aren't. The comparison becomes useful for a different reason. Both systems raise the same fundamental question. Who controls the asset that makes production possible? That question is already visible across the digital economy. A creator can own a camera, a microphone, and a laptop, yet depend on a platform to reach an audience. A driver can own a car, yet depend on a platform to reach passengers. A small business can produce a great product, yet depend on digital infrastructure to distribute it. The platform doesn't necessarily own the worker's labor. It controls the gateway through which that labor becomes economically valuable. AI can push this idea one step further. Instead of merely controlling the marketplace, a company can increasingly control the tool that performs the work itself. And that creates a strange possibility. Technology can make the individual worker more capable while simultaneously making the worker less necessary. That's the paradox. The same machine can increase your productivity and reduce the amount of labor the company needs. And now we have the first major twist. The most immediate threat from AI may not be mass unemployment. It may be fewer opportunities to enter the economy in the first place. Stanford's latest 2026 research found no evidence of widespread, economy-wide AI displacement. But among workers aged 22 to 25 in highly AI-exposed occupations, employment was about 19% lower than the researchers' comparison benchmark, with the difference appearing mainly through weaker hiring. That matters because careers traditionally have a hidden economic structure. You start at the bottom. You learn. You gain experience. You become more valuable. Then you move upward. But what happens when AI absorbs some of the routine tasks that use to teach beginners how the industry works? PwC's 2026 analysis of more than 1 billion job advertisements found that AI-exposed entry-level positions in the United States were 7 times more likely to demand skills traditionally associated with senior workers, such as judgment and leadership. At the same time, seniorized entry-level roles had grown 35% since 2019, while other entry-level roles declined 10%. That suggests something more subtle than simple job destruction. The ladder itself may be changing, and if the first rung disappears, telling everyone to climb harder isn't exactly a career strategy. That is where the peasant analogy becomes more uncomfortable. A peasant didn't simply lack income. He lacked ownership. The future worker could face a different version of the same problem. Not a lack of access to technology, but permanent dependence on technology owned by someone else. Now comes the part that complicates the entire story. Because there is a serious problem with the idea that AI is automatically creating a new class of peasants. The data does not support that simple conclusion. AI is already creating new kinds of work. Companies that use AI effectively can become more productive. Workers who know how to use AI can become more valuable. PwC's 2026 Global AI Jobs Barometer found that companies most able to use AI were experiencing faster headcount and wage growth than less AI-exposed companies. It also found that jobs requiring specific AI skills were growing far faster than the overall job market, with a substantial wage premium for workers possessing those skills. So, perhaps AI isn't creating peasants. Perhaps it is creating leverage. A worker with AI may be able to compete with an entire team that existed 10 years ago. A small business may be able to reach customers, analyze data, and produce content with a fraction of the resources once required. A developing country may even use AI to accelerate productivity without first building the entire industrial infrastructure that richer nations needed in previous eras. The World Bank's 2026 report estimates that 16.2% of jobs in developing economies could see meaningful productivity gains from AI, compared with 18.7% in high-income economies, while warning that gaps in skills, connectivity, and institutions could determine who benefits. So the question cannot simply be, is AI good or bad for workers? That's too easy. The more important question is, who captures the gains? Because productivity is not the same thing as prosperity. Imagine AI makes one worker twice as productive. There are several possible outcomes. The company could keep the extra profit. The worker could receive a higher wage. Prices could fall, giving consumers more purchasing power. The company could reinvest and hire more people. Or some combination of all four could happen. The machine itself doesn't decide. Ownership and institutions do. And this is where the biggest structural risk appears. AI infrastructure is expensive and increasingly interconnected. Chips, cloud computing, data centers, energy, and networking all sit underneath the systems workers depend on. The OECD has identified concentration and barriers to entry across several layers of this infrastructure, meaning access to the most important inputs may remain concentrated even while AI becomes widely available to consumers. So you can have a world where almost everyone uses AI, while very few people own the systems underneath it. That would create a strange economic arrangement. The worker has access to enormous productive power, but the ownership of that productive power sits somewhere else. And that is the real modern peasant scenario. Not people working in fields. People building businesses, writing code, creating videos, driving cars, analyzing information, and running companies. While the infrastructure that makes their work possible is increasingly rented from platforms they do not control. But there is still one final escape hatch. Competition. New companies can emerge. Open source models can reduce dependence on proprietary systems. Governments can regulate infrastructure. Workers can learn to use AI rather than compete directly against it. And if AI genuinely increases productivity, a society that distributes those gains broadly could become dramatically richer. That means the future is not predetermined. The machines are not deciding who becomes powerful. We are still deciding who gets to own the machines. And perhaps that is the real lesson hidden inside the comparison with feudalism. The danger was never simply that one class had better tools. The danger was that one class controlled the tools everyone else needed. AI could break that pattern by making extraordinary productive power cheap and widely available. Or it could reinforce it by turning the most important economic tools of the century into infrastructure that billions depend on but relatively few control. So the future question isn't whether AI will work. It already does. It isn't whether AI will make workers more productive. It already can. The question is what happens to the value created by that productivity. Because if AI becomes the most powerful economic machine humanity has ever built, there are two very different futures. In one, the machine becomes everyone's leverage. In the other, everyone becomes dependent on the machine's owners. And that is why the most important question about AI may not be, will it take your job? It may be, when a machine does the work, who owns a machine? Because if the answer is a tiny group of people, we may not become medieval peasants. We may become something far more modern. People with unprecedented access to technology and almost no ownership of the economic power behind it. If this story made you rethink what AI really means for the future of work, don't stop here. Subscribe for more deeply researched documentaries exploring technology, economics, history, and the forces reshaping our world. And tell me in the comments, when AI does the work, who should own the rewards?